Okay, we're recording.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Monday, September 23rd, using Qri call. Dun, 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 dun. We need like a jingle. I'd very much like a keyboard where I can just push the jingle button. Anyways, point being, today I kind of wanted to just, there's one thing on the agenda that I think we should really surface, building a little bit on some of the conversations that are happening over at Data Together. Kevin Nguyen posted an amazing message to me personally about thinking around the UX of the download button, which is kind of where we left off. Oh yes, and thank you for the agenda link, Rico. But Kevin had a great idea. I thought a great idea that we should totally put to the group for a conversation about what that download button does. And so specifically, we're talking about when you go to qri.cloud, there's a button right now that will download that doesn't do anything. And we're going to make it do something this week. And so I'd like to just save some time, if possible, to discuss what we would do, how we would sort of intersect that with some of our decentralized thinking, and if there should be what the UX around that might or might not look like. Before we get to that, and so that's, I think, unless anyone has any other ideas, I'd love to just have that discussion today and have that be the purpose of the call, and just like let that sort of dig in. And if that takes 10 minutes, awesome. And if it takes 20, then cool. We can take the whole half hour for it. Just to sort of, before we get to that though, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping items that are coming up with this sprint. So we just finished sprint R, and we have now moved on to sprint S. And more importantly, we have picked our sort of like initial beta release date, which is going to be October 1st for us, which coincides nicely with the beginning of a new quarter, and will be the moment where we sort of like put out some new stuff. And so with that, on Tuesday, October 1st, we'll be sending an email to everybody on the beta list with a link to the release. We will have cleaned up our website a little bit, and we'll be sort of knocking out some punch list items before then. And so very much appreciated. Yes, and Rico's also dropped a link to the beta, which is just qri.io/beta. If you two are okay with it, we can just throw you on that list, or we can just email you personally and not throw you on a list so you don't get stuff. But this is mainly just for people like yourselves, Kevin and Rob, who have been so gracious as to like help us build this out to begin with. You're kind of the origin of the beta program. And so it's we've been just formalizing it for reach to others. Yeah. So with that, I'd love to sort of just like launch into some of the stuff that Kevin, that you sent me. I can either, I would rather hear from you than from myself, if you're interested. But I guess before that, I should leave some space. Does anybody want to say anything on release notes or questions about the October 1st release?
No, other than just say, yeah, you can put me on the beta mailing list. It's cool.
I think we'll probably send one email when like there's a new release, and then most of the actual emailing will be like just direct to people. Like, hey, cool, you learned this. Awesome.
Oh yeah.
Not really like this high communication thing. We're still filling it out, but that our sense is just mainly to give people the clear indication that if you're on the beta list, you're somebody who can email us out of the blue, and we will prioritize your email and very much actively gather your feedback, if that makes sense. So thanks, Kevin, for joining our list. But yeah, do you want to take some time to talk us through the replicate button, or what do you think?
I think for me personally, I want to hear more about Qri Cloud in general, because I don't know if that has been talked about in other calls, because like I was just operating under assumptions, but like I know it's an evolution of registry, and so like a couple questions, it's like, well, how has it evolved from registry, and then what like kind of interaction do you guys foresee Qri Cloud and desktop? Like how are people going to switch back and forth? Are they working in it at the same time, or they end up only working in one, the ones that funnel to the other? Are they going to combine in some way because they're both kind of like web apps? So that type of stuff. Oh,
Rob.
I want to second that series of questions, also because I feel like I was thinking about a lot of thoughts I had after last week's discussion, and realized that I was struggling with what I wanted out of Qri, because I was struggling with like what all the different parts of it are actually intending to be. But also, like, as a stupid first question, I'd never tried clicking on the download button on Qri Cloud. Is it just like a placeholder right now? Because it doesn't work for me. It doesn't do anything for me. Okay, just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something obvious.
No, it doesn't do anything, and we haven't been sending anybody to Qri.cloud. So you're the only people who really know about it, aside from us. There's some folks like Astro and Jonathan who we also work with a bunch know about it, but yeah, it's definitely a very quiet thing for now. Public, but quiet. Yeah, happy to talk about the evolution of the registry, and I think that's a very good thing. I feel like we're a little thin on documentation on this. Starting in the beginning, when Chris showed up, we really sort of started onto this path of trying to build a product, like just turn the corner and make something that was useful. And so out of that, we carved the Qri Desktop experience, which is intended for dataset crafting specifically, just being able to sort of like focus in on the notion of how do I make a version of a dataset and then link that to a publish button. That sort of carving experience was very much, and so before we had the desktop conversation at all, we had something called front end, and we had something called we just had app.qri.io, which was theoretically linked to the registry. And front end was a sort of a kitchen sink of experiences. You could browse with it, you could download with it, you could craft with it. There's like an edit section, and there was like a browsing section. We found that the front end was really hard to maintain and really hard to sort of like tell somebody what to do with it. That was the biggest sort of thing that we had. For the feedback that we had from the front end when we showed it to people, they were like, okay, what am I supposed to do here? And it's like, well, you can do whatever you want. Well, it's like, that's not helpful. And so we decided to sort of like cut our technical projects along the lines of their sort of use case and have launch Qri.cloud as the entire browsing experience. If you're browsing datasets and you're looking around at datasets, we think that should be an experience. And we're not even talking about the registry yet, but we think that should be an experience that is easy, requires no downloading of any app, and allows you to sort of just see all of the public datasets that exist. Ideally, in the long term, you can then authenticate and you can then see whatever private datasets you've been given permission to access. But the real division line between desktop and cloud that was not there in the front end and registry side of the world was desktop is for editing stuff, cloud is for browsing stuff. And so you should really be able to sort of browse around Qri.cloud and see, very similar to the way we have a GitHub repository with a profile and a set of repositories that you're proud of. We think that's what should happen on the cloud side. Now, I think the really important thing is I've intentionally not said the word registry yet, because registry sort of really specifically speaks to some technical stuff, and we have made a lot of evolutions there. Where I'll sort of try and finish this really quickly is with how we haven't really, there's a number of open-ended questions about how the cloud conversation sort of fits into the technical implementations of decentralization. And I think that's at the UX side. On the technological side, I think we've made some really major progress. One of the biggest things, so since the registry code has been into existence, we have since carved away a number of features out of it and moved those into the peer-to-peer side. And so specifically that surrounds publishing datasets. So like pushing a dataset to somebody. You can now do, for a long time it's been possible, although a little difficult. You have to spin up an HTTP server and like have a permanent web address that someone could push to, but you can push datasets there. We've since sewn in the peer-to-peer dataset sync stuff. We have to service some last UI in this latest release, but you will be able to say, query push Mr. Ogrog, this dataset. And if Mr. Ogrog, the user, has said, I will accept datasets from this person, then they will accept it. And so that, and the registry, the cloud registry, Qri.cloud, works exactly like a remote. And so we now have introduced the phrase remote for anyone else that you can sort of push to and pull to. And so the registry does less stuff. It's basically a remote plus two very special things. And we've managed to get those two special things down to just unique usernames and search. Those are the only things that registry does that a remote doesn't do by default. So we now have, when you do query publish, the default is Qri.cloud, which is a registry, but it's also a remote. And so under the hood, it says, okay, cool, I'm just gonna push this data set to that remote, and then that's it. When you sign up for a query, like you do the initial sign up, we do unique username enforcement against a registry, and only Qri.cloud can do that for now. There is an interface for it, and we could later on talk about sort of like stratifying it to like a sort of Mastodon style multi-tenant, multi-username universe. I don't know that that's something that we, Qri the corporation, will be pushing, but it's definitely something that should be possible if someone wanted to, for instance, build the GitLab to GitHub. I think it should be a lab, and I think it should be an interface that you know clearly where to plug into. That was really long-winded. There's a lot of points of interaction here, and there's sort of the technical side and there's the UX side. On the UX side, we think it's really important that Qri publish to Qri.cloud should seamlessly create this like natural extension of a web interface that you can see data sets on without any thought. And to us, that's really important. You should, at the same time, we should not be the single source of truth for data. And so the thing that we can do, that you can do on this technical level right now, is Qri publish someone else. What does that mean? And what happens when that, the way that happens right now is that data set shows up in that user's list of data sets. That content gets pinned to their IPFS node, and they hang on to a copy of it until they either choose to delete it or they honor a request from you to remove it. But as it stands, that's a really long-winded answer around what is happening. High level, we've tried to make the registry smaller. We tried to make this notion of remotes bigger, and we plan to expand the notion of remotes over registries because we think it's more important. And the Qri.cloud web experience is an extension of a remote registry combo. Okay, I'm going to shut up now. Is that in any way helpful?
When you said query publish, did you mean query publish from the command line and then it'll show up on Qri.cloud?
Or from the app? Both do the same thing.
Cool. And I had another question slightly. This might just help. So I've been hearing you guys both say linking data and pinning data. Are they the same thing or different?
Of course they're different. Why would they be the same thing? That would be too easy. When you say pinning data, that is, I agree to keep a copy, which is keep that data set in IPFS. And then when you say linking data, that's saying, here's a version of my data set on my computer that works a lot like a Git repository, where if I edit this meta.json file, that will be staged as a set of edits for creating a new version. So linking only really applies. Oh, yeah, sorry, is that enough?
No, can you continue? Linking is like staging in Git. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. The way, you know how if you're using Git and you CD to a repository or to a folder, and it's like, and you're now in a Git folder, that's linking is all that. So like whenever we're talking about linking, we're saying a linked directory, which is basically saying a directory on your computer is connected to a history of data sets inside of the query, which is backed by IPFS.
Okay, might have to chew on that.
Yeah, as I say it out loud, it's really hard.
Yeah, because I'm like, yeah.
We have been sort of, go ahead, sorry, Kevin.
I'm just like, because I'm not, that's why like the confusion is like, how is that? Because I didn't know the assumptions, so then I'm not sure like the UI, UX of Qri.cloud, like where is linking happening there too, or just pinning, or did it, like when you want to download something, like what's going to happen?
Yeah. And so I think it's useful to distinguish between like a versioned set of data set and just a CSV file, right? And so so when we hit download, you can just download a CSV file, and that's it. It's going to come with some metadata, but it's effectively just a file of data. That is not versioned, right? And so when you place that same CSV file in a linked directory, it's now connected to a version history. And so there's a way now when you say query status, I can tell you there are changes, or query can tell you there are changes. And and the only way you can do that is if that folder is linked to your database of versions.
And is linking a thing that's specific to query, or is that also was that something in IPFS?
No, we had to invent this concept.
Okay.
Yeah. So the problem is the data actually lives inside of IPFS, right? So this is where we've been considering using just the phrase database for saying your database of versions. So imagine there's a database of all of your versions of data sets somewhere on your computer, and you can't get at those files, right? Because they're stored in some crazy format that isn't regularly accessible. And so we link that database to a folder, and that folder contains much easier to use files that are like body.csv. And but the verbiage link is something we had to invent on the fly.
Yeah. Okay. Good to know.
I so desperately want to be like, but what's the answer, Kevin? But like, you're just figuring out, you're getting your head around the thing now. Yeah. As we've been talking, yeah. And so like, just to try and give you more to chew on, when you publish to Query Cloud, you can only publish versions, so stuff from inside of the database. And so you can only say, cool, I've made a version, right? I've run git commit. You can't publish, or you can't git push stuff that you haven't committed. Same way, you can't query publish stuff that you haven't committed. So run query save and then query publish, and that's going to publish the most recent sort of like sealed off version of your data set and put it on the internet. Yeah, and so when you publish to Query Cloud, you can see stuff on the HTTP side, and that's all sort of like special sauce that we make. But under the hood, that's also just a remote running and connected to IPFS. And so at that point, when you run Query Publish, it's also available on IPFS.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we want people to be able to sort of just get the data and ignore the versioning system, mainly because people don't like this whole conversation, as we can tell, is very confusing. So I think there's just like, hey, I don't care, just give me the unversioned latest, give me the latest. And so that's what we think one purpose of the download button is. But circling back to the conversation that you were sort of starting, we also have this other notion of like versions of a data set in a database that we need help making sure are kept around. And that's where you, Kevin, sent me this wonderful note about how wouldn't it be cool if download was split into two options, where we had just download, which is essentially what our classic sense of the word download, which is give me a CSV file, and then the word that you used was replicate, which is like click this button, which is an agreement to add something to a database that I have and carry it back up.
Yeah, and also download it at the same time. Yeah. Because that's what you're doing anyways to replicate. You have to download it. So, I guess another question.
Yeah, you have to. Yeah.
Another question before we get too far is just like, I understand the split between browsing and editing, like discoverability and like working with the data. And do you think those two will combine in some sense in the future? You split it off because it's just so hard to manage, but it seems like they should be in one thing. I guess the splitting off of like visualization and all that stuff made sense because it was like too many features at this point. But yeah, like will the discoverability and the working, like the editing, like come together?
It's a good question. How do you feel about it?
Maybe Rob has some feelings. Rob.
I mean, I definitely have some feelings, but I don't want to jump on this with a very long esoteric set of thoughts until you've had a chance to get your attention.
Yeah, well,
I'm going to be in probably a way different place than you are.
That's true. I mean, I think they should be the same because it just seems weird to like have to like find data in a different place than where I'm actually working with data. Because like I'm just going back and forth between like these two different contexts, like switches seems very difficult in the long run. Like if I was just to be using this. Yeah, because if I was working on a data set like, climate 1998, and then I wanted to find climate 1999, to continue like evaluating a model, like what do I do?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important question. How does that work? Right. I think there are some ways to cheat it along the way, but I also think that the fundamental question that you're asking is really interesting. Rob, I really want to hear your tangent as well. Good.
So I have some thoughts like that I've generated specifically in response to this discussion, but also things that have been gestating in the back of my head for the past week. And they're related. But I guess the first reaction I have to like this discussion about the download button is I feel like there's a real tough question around just the idea of downloading, right? Like if part of the thing that makes Qri important and special is that it's distributed, providing a download button, especially as the first option and the easy option, is antithetical to this sort of environment you want to create. Right? Because as soon as somebody downloads that, it's divorced from this idea of like sharing and rehosting and distributedly providing a set of data. So it feels like, you know, per that idea of like splitting it in two, that's really important. And it also feels like maybe it's important that the primary easy option, so far as it's easy, is whatever causes you to sort of rehost that data, as it were, right? To reprovide it, to rehost it, to share it, whatever the right terminology is that's clear, right? To pin and share it locally. But that invites a lot of other questions, I think, that are somewhat unclear for me, at least, as to like what the right way to be running Qri locally is, right? Like, I presume that when Qri Desktop is running in the normal situation, like I'm just a like user who doesn't know a whole lot about the internals, and I double click on Qri Desktop and I have it running. That I am also running Qri Connect behind the scenes, which is effectively running an IPFS daemon. So not only do I have something locally that pulls down data and has an API to access it, but it's also participating in distributed web, and while it's running, like people might be getting data from me. But to what extent does that happen like after I close Qri? Should it be happening after I close Qri, right? Is it, if I'm on a Mac, like should there be like a menu bar item or some kind of daemon thing that's happening? How do I manage and control the idea that there's like behind the scenes stuff that's always running because it's a distributed system that's important that like I'm on and sharing. And there's like a whole lot of complicated questions about how, like whether that's the right model, how to show that to a user and make it approachable and non-problematic, that have been like sitting in the back of my head. And I guess the other thing that I've been thinking about, like in conjunction with that, is I feel like there's some different sorts of things you could be doing with data on Qri that aren't exposed in clear ways either on Qri Cloud or like on your local client and UI, which is the sense of like I've got some data and am I like resharing it or whatever, like the idea, like in my head, the term I've been using is like follow or track data set, right? Because I think, you know, if I've pulled down somebody else's data set, like probably theoretically what I want is to like follow that data, so that when it gets updated remotely, at least I know that it's updated. Now that we've moved to this idea of like things being reflected on the file system, that invites other complicated questions of like, well, I should know that there's new commits, but do they show up in my file system, or do I have to like pull them to get them from the Qri database, my local Qri database, like onto my file system? And like, what do things mean then and there? Or like, is the point of linking data to allow Qri to just like update my file system? And is that a happy situation? Or am I like, I was doing things there. Why'd you fuck with it? So like that's there in my head. And there's also like, because there's a whole distributed web nature to it, is there a situation that's important wherein I'm supporting, rehosting, resharing, whatever, a data set that I'm not necessarily working on, right? That, and so is there a way, a situation where something is sort of like in my local database, it's being, you know, re-provided by Query Connect, but I'm not necessarily having it like checked out somewhere on my file system as a working thing until maybe I want to later or whatever. You know, or if I've committed a whole bunch of stuff and I'm like done with it, I want to delete that file on my local system, but it's still like in my database. Like understanding that situation, if that should even be a real situation, like that kind of, I don't know. Those are like the set of things I've been thinking through in relation to the like download idea. It's a very stream of consciousness, no clear thing to say there, but.
Good stuff.
Wow, yeah, that's really, really, really helpful. I think it's, yeah, there's a lot of things to pick up there. And I was just taking notes, obviously, what you're talking about, because I think a lot of that really plays. To try and, I think it's worth actually rewinding to pretty close to the top of what you're saying, mainly because I think it sits at the intersection of what both you and Kevin are sort of thinking about and pulling at that part. Some of these other things I want to sort of like, I've taken notes on and definitely want to start to unpack over time. It's definitely not enough to do in this call because I think the questions surrounding the underlying daemon and this like, I think one of the biggest impasses here is like a lack of language to describe some of our sort of like sharing fundamentals. And this like, yeah, like we've been talking about this, like Chris, you and I talked about this, like the other scenario that kind of plays out here where someone goes to install Query in a more corporate environment, like so they're at a school and they put Query on a local computer network, and all of a sudden Query, this thing under the hood, spins up IPFS, which starts poking at all these ports and like doing all of these things that seem a little bit like kind of like, what are you doing there, little application? And some sysadmin says, no, you're not allowed to run Query on here. And like, how do we make sure that we're properly conveying expectations around what Query is doing when Qri Desktop or Qri Connect is running? And so we've been thinking about this a bunch from that angle. But I think it's worth sort of like, right at the gates, you said, Rob, it's important to figure out how to present the notion of like rehosting and this notion that the download button just giving the file is antithetical. So I want to add like one little piece of what we've been thinking on that side, because I'm sure you guys remember, I sort of started on this like, I don't think we should have a download button at all. Like you should have to download the app to be able to even get the data set. But then, you know, Enrico, I think really rightfully represented the notion of like, yeah, but like someone's doing the work of creating great version data that's maintained well. Like, why should we get in their way? Like, why should we force them to buy whole hog into our versioned thing? And before giving them, like, if you're just someone who really would benefit from having a well-maintained list of this population of the state of Wyoming, like, is it really our place to say like, no, you must participate fully? And so what we've been talking about, and we haven't really surfaced issues around this, but when you hit the download button, where we'd like to land is like you get with that a PDF document, and intentionally PDF, something that everybody can open, that says, hey, like you're missing version control. Like this is here's all the metadata. Here's actual useful information about this. This isn't just like a flyer, but it also says, this is the version of the data set that you just downloaded, and like actually include the hash in that PDF. It was last published. These were how many versions were published before. Here's a link to download a system to actually download and start rehosting this data. And actually like use that as a sort of an on-ramp instead of, because I think, Rob, it is, what I'd like to go back to you is like, I think that it's a very valid point of saying that maybe it is antithetical. Maybe we should say, no, you have to participate, you know, like DC++ style, right? Seeders and leechers, you got to keep your seed rate at 1 to get to download all that cool new content. Anyone else, feel free to jump in here, but I think it's worth thinking about.
I guess on my mind is this notion that like you can still participate in the version control ecosystem around a data set without any of the peer-to-peer stuff, which can always either come later or come when we have sufficiently like added enough correct verbiage and UI to actually explain well what's happening there, because we have none of that right now, right? We can say it's kind of like GitHub, or it's kind of like Git, and you like pull this thing down and you have a copy of it locally, and there's a folder that it's talking to, but like we don't really touch on any of like you are running a server now, which is going to be frightening for some people. So yeah, I wonder if we can like get away with it as a short-term measure, like the P2P stuff is there, but like there is still value even without P2P. There's still value in like you can explore the history of this data set. You can cloning it or pulling it down is a good thing that brings a lot more than just a CSV file would. I don't know. I'm just wondering if there's like a middle ground that is not really, it's there, but we don't talk about it. And maybe it's like, is there really value in that node resharing all these data sets right now, or is that more future potential value, right? Like if Query Cloud is like if it is the centralized thing that everyone talks to for the first year, is that so bad?
So I just want to say, like, first off, the reason I didn't say you shouldn't have a download button, just that it shouldn't be the primary thing, is because I totally agree. Both there's the sense that like not everybody, 90% of people who come to this won't be familiar with like query or distributed stuff or whatever, and it's like a big barrier to download the whole application and rehost it, and like that's a bad place to force somebody to start. So thumbs up there. I think the PDF coming with the download is a little bit weird. Maybe there could be like a dialogue in between hitting download and actually getting it. I don't know. But I agree. I think the thing I would say in response to what you were saying there, Chris, is that, and this might be very different for other people, but for me, I'm not interested in query for versioning. I think that is a great bonus feature, and I'm really, 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 really happy that it is a first-class feature. But there are other ways I can do that right now. And the thing that's important to me about query, that's the primary concern, is that it's distributed. Obviously, like I'm coming from a particular context in Edgy, where we got interested in query purely out of the concern that the thing we wanted to find a way to change is the literal fact that most public data, like public data sets, comes from a single authority in a single place. And in the sense of like somebody else trying to back it up, make sure it stays available, etc. Like there's real barriers to there. It's a lot of work to do it. It's hard to prove that you have the exact same thing because we don't have like hashes and everything else. But also just that like it should be straightforward to have a system within which like what gets published publicly is like broadly supported in a way that makes it hard for a single authority to either make a mistake or out of malintent take it away from everybody else. Like it's in the public domain and it needs to have a technical system that helps support that rather than one that relies on everybody having to either do a lot of work or not ever make a mistake to make sure that stays alive. So, like, I totally feel the ideas on like, there's a lot of value in having like versioning of my data here. But if that were the only thing, I wouldn't really be using query. And it's definitely secondary for me, for Edgy, to the fact that it is distributed and that it supports a system that encourages people to participate in sort of providing, rehosting, resharing, whoever's language you want to use. keeping that data available and alive. Which is also why I'm kind of interested in this idea of like following or tracking or whatever. Like, how do I also make sure that my version of it is keeping up to date with the latest published one? Right? Like, people ask this similar question in IPFS lots of the time. Like, how do I make sure that I'm like following an IPNS name? To which the answer is we don't have anything for that, even though it seems obvious that there should be some way to like follow that.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Back to first principles. Chris, you got anything?
No, I mean, it's good to hear another perspective that is not it's not focused on version control. But yeah, I don't know, I guess, yeah, just acknowledging that like we aren't really even explaining that. You have to like dig through her website to like hear all this stuff about PPD. Like, there's no way to even infer that kind of stuff is happening, you know, when you fire up Qri Desktop. Better ways to communicate that and get people excited about it. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think there's a real, right, like the place is like, why has no one built GitHub for Data? It's because GitHub for Data is not cost effective, right? We like you actually can't do that. You can't say upload whatever you want ad infinitum, because that's creating a massive S3 bill for somebody. And this is where like, this is why I revel in this problem, is because we can't, and why Qri has been like an amazing project that has years of value to me, because we have, you have to solve both problems at the same time. You can't just deal with one or the other. You have to figure out a way to both establish some sort of ground truth in data, as you were talking, Rob, about, okay, we can all agree that this version was created, whether it was, and then if we agree that that version was improperly created, we create another version to mark the change. And so we need the versioning side of things, but you also need the distribution side of things figured out. And I think the place where we really struggle is this terminology stuff. I like this notion of following. We've taught to bring in some other examples. IPFS cluster has just done pin set following. I think you can now say, I agree to follow that set of pins, which they have landed a little while ago, which is very, very cool. And I think a really interesting thing that we should be looking at, particularly on the data together node stuff. But for us, Kevin, I think the biggest moment in this conversation was when you were like, what is linking? You said linking and pinning and following. And then Rob, you alluded to this too, where this like really confusing interaction between the file system versions of a thing and following a thing. How does that work? And then on top of that, like where, look, we know the Qri Desktop is where authors of data sets will have the easiest experience creating new data sets. And Jonathan, welcome. Just so you know, we're recording. So if you don't want to be recorded, don't turn on your video, but we are definitely recording this call. Yeah, and we're just talking about, actually, you might be interested in this. We're talking about figuring out some terminology for following versus pinning. Yeah, Kevin, what I want to drill in on some of your confusion around the file system and some of your expectations there. So let's just pretend for a second we have something resembling what Rob was explaining of like following a data set. So Rob, in this example, Rob, you are making a data set, and Kevin, you are trying to follow it. What do you want to be able to do with that data set, Kevin? And what clear intents do you want to be able to like articulate? And you can speak purely from your own, like, I think very much. Yeah, we can forget about the file system. Just like, what do you want to be able to do? Like, what do you want to be able to do? Rob's publishing a data set. What do you want to be able to do to it?
This is just brand new, and it's interesting because then this is not actually a feature, right? This following that you're talking about, this is just something that Rob talked about. And then the confusion around the file system, I think we can get it now. Yeah, the linking is just, like you said, it's just like staging things, and it's part of the version control, which is specific to Qri query. That was my confusion, because I wasn't sure, because I hadn't heard the term linking before, because I've only been like following IPFS stuff, and so I thought it was related to pinning in some way, but now I know it's not. So that confusion has actually been cleared up, so it's okay. I mean, like, hot takes off of the following idea, I think it's really cool. And I hope we can actually, that's my point, I hope we can touch back on the replicate thing now that we've had all this conversation, because that's like, I think, a concrete first step. But back to the following thing, yeah, just like being updated when that data set is updated, I guess, and that's like implicit in following. I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe it's like Rob's idea. Like, Rob, like, how do you envision that kind of working? Or what would you want from it?
I mean, I've had a lot of different thoughts about it, many of which are like somewhat in conflict. You know, like I was trying to find some time to like sit down and really think through these ideas last week, so that I could write up some questions about them instead of just going with my blathering stream of consciousness 10 minutes ago. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what I want out of it, other than, like, I think making it easy and encouraging me to turn on whatever sort of activity on my machine supports re-providing data is important. And I also think that if I'm looking at somebody else's data set, to the extent that, like, this is a system where people are like publishing different things online, like a really valuable part of that, and part of both of those things is me being able to know when something else has been updated, and maybe in some way automatically pulling down that data. I really don't know what I want in terms of, like, the question that immediately comes up for me is like, okay, if I'm mirroring this data onto some like normal, easily accessible location on disk, as opposed to just like some abstract space in the query database, like, do I want it to just update there, like Dropbox style? Or do I want it to not, and just have the new stuff in the database, like Git style, right? Am I treating this as a place where I'm actively working, so I don't want it to get overwritten? Or am I treating this as a place of like active collaboration, where I do? And this collides for me headfirst into like the other thing I was thinking about that is in there when I talked about, like, I'm not sure exactly what Qri aims to be and Qri Cloud aims to be, both with each other and with some other things, right? Because the other thing that pops into my head with all this stuff is, I mean, I've talked before about wanting to be able to connect multiple tables or data sets together better. That in my head, I really want a data set to be able to be more compound and more of a database. And so, like, I very probably unsurprisingly jump to, like, I want like the distributed version of like Airtable, you know, and like I like that query is oriented towards supporting, like, yeah, if somebody's working in Excel and they're doing all their work in Excel, like, don't get in the way of that. But at the same time, like, maybe not everybody is, or maybe not everybody has Excel installed, or like maybe Excel doesn't model the types of connections and foreign key-ish type things and links that you want to model. Like, I mean, really, yeah, I don't know. Like, I start with the basic things that are in query, and I hesitate to say too much about this because it's too much to bite at once. Like, I don't think y'all should like jump towards these really big ideas. But in my head, like, I want to see the foundations of, like, I want my distributed file maker or Airtable or whatever, like, thing along those lines. It's like where I deeply, like, in some place in my heart, like, want this to eventually land. You know, like with versioning and everything else, like the amazing, perfect land of data, which doesn't actually exist. But like that, I don't know. I'm again, like, very, haven't thought through all of this very much. And you ask that question, and it starts in this one place, and it goes into this other set of ideas. I don't know if that was helpful at all.
Yeah, Kevin, did you have something?
Oh, no, I just,
your issue.
yeah, no, I'm just like absorbing it. It's useful. I like it. Does definitely far feature, and glad that like Rob like shared it.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to. Yeah, I think we have definitely planned foundations to be able to go in a lot of those places. I think one of the things that we're really running up against, as we've worked, has been like just how hard it is to realize something in a clean, easy to understand experience that somebody can get their head around. And we have, I think, one of the most exciting things about some of the work that we do is we're like we're really able to envision these radical futures that I think are very exciting. But the real slog comes from like, okay, cool. Like if we just, like today I was like, let's just pull apart this replicate button, because like to me that's, and I'm so glad that this conversation has gone in so many directions, but like it speaks to just how hard it is to like, because it's a complete paradigm shift, right? You're now moving the act of moving the server onto someone's machine is a really big shift, and you have to be really prepared to answer, well, why are we doing this, and to put that and to make sure that we're getting expectations as right as possible, while also sort of like bringing our users with us, is a really as the more we unpack this stuff, and particularly the more we look at desktop, like Kevin, where you're like, yeah, we should be able to like browse on desktop. It's like, yeah, totally. But the idea of planning that system in and making it like clean and work well right now, like, we've had enough trouble just getting like the browse experience. Like we don't even have the browse experience finished on cloud yet, right? Let alone that's a website. Like that's easily the easiest of all of the flows that we'll ever do.
Just thinking through, trying to solidify things a little bit more, like to pull back from my like far future stuff to like because the set of things I feel like I'm locking onto, or that I deeply want, is this like distributed reproviding of data and idea of like following things, because the whole like data set, it's got to be up to date if I've got somebody else's stuff, or I want to know when I'm missing some new update or whatever. Like I think one of the things I see in my head as the ideal version of like Qri Desktop is that in some fashion it operates sort of like I don't know, like Postgres app does, or like the Keybase app does on OS 10, where I have some kind of like menu bar thing that lets me know that it's like running and what its status is, and provides me a really easy way to be like, stop, like you're using too much network or resources or whatever. Like, but like I can set its default state to be like always running when I start my machine, or I can say no. Like it should be okay to say no, because there's definitely plenty of situations where either I'm traveling and I don't have data, or like I just have low resources and I can't afford to be like a major reproviding node on the network, and I need to act just more like a client. But to have like the default setup that like that kind of thing is running, but there's an obvious way to see and affect its status and activity. For me is like principle, or would be a really good approach to it. But again, that's because I'm very focused on the like distributed aspect of this much more than the like version controlled. Like I can see a chain of history aspect of it. Right? That's like the thing I jump onto first, is like that. And then maybe the ability to like turn on and off providing certain data sets, because there might be something that I've pulled down that I don't necessarily want to reshare. Because like maybe I pulled it down because I think it's like it's something I'm investigating, but I also think it's like it's bad data that I don't want to participate in resharing, right? Like that whole concept absolutely exists now in this distributed situation, right? Something that otherwise might be censored or whatever, that I don't want to participate in the network of. And so I want probably some way to see like what is actually being reprovided from my list of data sets and turn some on and off, which like that also might be possibly the most extremely hard piece of this, given that.
I don't think it's that bad.
Okay, I don't know, because IPFS I don't feel like really has an effective system around that kind of thing. But
They've recently added a no reprovide thing. Chris.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know, quick question. I think we've had this conversation before, or at least I have somebody since I've been here, but like, is your, is the laptop that you do your day-to-day business on really where you're going to be an effective resharer of these data sets? If it's not Qri Cloud, which is, also basically publishing it on your behalf, but it's still decentralized, or still centralized and really not in your control, versus like the ability for, I don't know, like I'm just thinking out loud here, but is there like a, Docker image that you can run effortlessly on any server you have, that becomes like your actual place where you publish things that are in a more, in a more permanent state, in a more accessible place where the peer-to-peer network can grab them. I guess, I don't know, we've talked about this before, but is that like the notion of like it's a remote, but it's not ours queries, it is yours, but maybe we help keep track of it, like our registry is indexing it all the time and making stuff discoverable. I don't know, I keep coming back to like, it's like I can imagine this world where a desktop has another pane where it's just showing all this like peer-to-peer activity, and then I can also imagine like, is that really where we're going to get the most bang for our buck on this like peer-to-peer thing? Is that everybody's just, like, there's 10 data sets that I'm working with because those are that's the project that I'm working on right now. And then once they're done, I'm just going to get rid of them because I don't want them taking up space on my machine. And like, this laptop is not where I'm going to be surfacing, my archive of data. Like that's not what my laptop's for. I don't know.
I think that's a super fair point, but I think that also sort of runs headfirst into the environment, ecosystem, community change that is at issue, right? Like in a distributed system where the value is that something is well supported by virtue of being shared by many people, what are you doing to that system if you delete it when you're done working on it? I think my answer to your first set of questions around like, is my local machine really the place to be doing all this? Again, like super legit question. And I think the answer will be yes for some people and no for other people. But I also think that if we really, or if part of the goal, if an important part of the goal is really to support a broadly distributed system, it ought to be as easy as possible to participate in that. And like, if my day-to-day machine is a notebook computer that I'm constantly opening and closing and carrying all over town, like it might not be a great place to reshare things from. Or maybe like it needs to be sensitive enough to know that like, oh, if I'm on a like tethered network to my phone, like it should probably turn itself off, right? But if I've got a wired Ethernet connection plugged in, like turn itself on. But like that's complicated, and better starting place is just to let me turn it on or off. But I think to back up from that, like I want, may be different from what actually works in practice, but I want it to be super simple, and I want like some community organization or group to be able to make it run and participate in that network. And maybe that means like somebody sets up a machine in the office or like at home in their, under the desk in the side of the living room or the kitchen, that's always plugged in. And like, well, if I'm super smart, like I've set that up as a Linux machine. Maybe I'm running Docker image, I'm running Qri Connect. But like, if I'm somebody who's like less pro than that, like, I don't know, it's just like a Mac Mini I shoved under there, or like some tiny, Windows box that I bought. And so I just want to like turn on Qri Desktop and set it to like reshare and rehost stuff. So I think like that's why I feel like it should be in there, so that it's as accessible as possible, right? And it might be that the balance is like really somebody should be in that situation where they're setting up a dedicated machine for it. So maybe the default status is not to have it re-provided. That's something you have to opt into or turn on. Like, I think that's fair. Because like, as much as I want to like use this as a tool for encouraging and creating an ecosystem and environment around distributed data sharing, like that's a lot to ask people to jump into in an entire world and environment that is structured in a completely different way right now.
I love this. It's a very useful conversation. Yeah, it's 3 o'clock, so I don't want to keep people for too long past this. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting, I think we should have a think on this. I love the articulation of a toolbar. I think that's a really, and I think it's fair to say that we, the conversation here has been the uncovering of a use case that like we haven't, to your point, Rob, we really haven't built a lot of UI around, we haven't done a lot of UX research around. And I think we should, to me, this, Kevin, if it's cool with you, I think I asked in chat to file this issue around replicate, and I think this is the beginning of what will be more conversations around what I think should be actually termed as a completely different like user persona for us, like the data preservationist, and look at because we take every feature off the shelf and we say, okay, data chef, data foodie, enterprise grade customer, why are we not saying data preservationist, somebody who's participating in this work? And it blows my mind, given how long I've worked at Edgy, that isn't a stated and explicit thing right now at always. And yeah, because I think there's a lot to be unpacked here. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much of other people's time, but yeah, like my vibe right off the bat, like what would be amazing if we could just smash code into existence. We would have some sort of toolbar thing that actually comes really close to what Rob is saying in Qri Desktop. Oh, am I frozen? Yeah, I'm frozen, aren't
I see you just fine. Oh, not anymore though.
Hello?
Hello?
Anybody hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Hear you now.
Hello?
Hello?
Barely. Can you hear me? Hello? Anybody?
We can hear you. Can you see us, hear us?
Okay, cool. Hopefully. I can't see you, but that's okay. I think I should probably just say, this is amazing. Let's continue this conversation. There's lots of cool stuff to unpack here. So as a follow-up, I'm going to file a bunch of issues and tag you guys, if that's okay.
Cool.
Sound good?
Yep.
Amazing. Okay. Well, I apologize. I'm talking to a bunch of screens that aren't moving, but thank you so much for this call. Have a wonderful time, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
And
Bye.
see you around.